Next time Peck's going to do it. Just kidding.
We're a pretty quiet group, I have to say that.
Yeah, it's always a little tricky with the big group, right?
And there is only one Lisa Clark, I'm afraid.
Aw. So
That's not true. There's another
That is
one.
not true. Do you need the story? No, we shouldn't do the story now. But ask me later.
Terrifying as that may be.
Because of my story? Thanks a lot, Dan.
No, just that there are two of you.
There's actually 3, and we started a little Facebook group to find Liesl Clarks. So. All right.
I don't know what I just came into, but I'm not sure if I want to.
I was telling stories about all the Liesl Clarks. Dan Scripps is ratting me out. Thank you, Governor. Excited to see you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So you're at the second Council on Climate Solutions, and our special guest has announced herself. So I'm just going to hand it over to her. Governor, we're so thrilled to have you with us today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Liesl, and thank you, everybody. I've got a number of directors and cabinet members on this Zoom, and state departments and members of the council. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm sorry I could not join you for the first meeting, but it's a pleasure to be with you today. You know, we're all here because we share the same vision for our future, and I'm grateful each of you has chosen to dedicate some of your valuable time. I know how many hats you all wear to be a part of this ongoing, really important conversation. You know, we've started making progress in Michigan, and I know we've all been focused on the health crisis that we're confronting, but even through that, we have been, I think, forging important territory here, and we remain committed to our ambitious goals that we set, including the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. Last year, I followed up our that commitment with an executive directive to put Michigan's economy on the path to becoming 100% carbon neutral by 2050. And it's a bold target, but it's absolutely doable if we work together. So you all know better than anyone, climate change is not something any of us can tackle alone. We all have to work at this together, and we need to solve the big global problems by setting aggressive goals and putting forth bold solutions, and including a lot of different voices at the table. So I think this council really reflects the diversity of voices that need to be involved in these decisions. We've got advocates, we've got labor leaders, community leaders, business leaders, scientists, everyone working together. And if we continue our partnership, I know we can chart a path forward that will improve our air and our water, enhance our public health, prevent natural disasters, and create a lot of good paying jobs too. So I'm hopeful that all of you will help develop that plan, and not only meets our commitment to decarbonize by 2050, but also focuses on lifting up communities that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change, and plans to ensure no community is left behind while we make this important transition. So this is work that is an investment in our communities and our state and our country, and will create long-lasting change for generations of Michiganders and Americans and people to come. So it's not a small task, but I know that we're up to it. So thank you for your commitment to serving the state, and for spending so much of your time and your expertise to helping us not just survive a transition, but thrive and prosper and drive it. So here's to that future. I'm very excited about the work that we're going to do together, and I say let's get it done. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Governor. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks,
Getting a silent clap.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we're going to launch into our agenda. With that is opening comments. So what a great grounding for our second discussion, and really appreciate a fantastic launching point from the governor. So first, we are going to go through and do a roll call. So I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, and we're going to start right at the top. So hopefully folks can be ready. So first, I'm going to go to Frank Beaver. Frank, are you with us today?
I am present today. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Mary Draves.
I'm here. Thank you.
Hey, Mary. Carrie Dugan.
Here.
Hey, Carrie. Jim Harrison.
I am here. Thank you.
Great. Brandon Hoffmeister.
I'm here.
Hey. Marnice Jackson. Oh, sounds like we don't have Marnice yet. I'm sure we'll pick her back up later. Phyllis Meadows.
I'm here.
Hi, Phyllis.
Hi there.
Peck.
I am here.
Like me, he goes by one name. Tanya Pezlowski.
Here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Cynthia Render Williams.
Present.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hello.
Bill Roos.
I'm here. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Phil. Darrell Slaughter.
Here. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Darrell. Sam Stolper.
I am here. Hi, everyone. Thank you.
And poor Ron Vogelweed with a V.
Last and usually least.
Not least.
I'm here.
Okay. Now we're going to run through the departments as well. So, Director Adjaba.
Here.
Thanks for joining us. I don't know. Do we have anybody from MEDC? Okay. Director Corbin.
I'm here. Thank you.
Director Eichinger.
Present. Good afternoon.
Treasurer Eubanks.
Hello, present.
You sound a little froggy. Might be your connection. Director Hertel. Do you have anybody from DHHS? Maybe Aaron?
This is Megan Groen. I'll be representing Director Hertel. Thank you.
Hi, Megan.
I think Aaron's here too.
Great. Director McDowell.
Present.
Chairman Scripps.
I'm here.
And then I don't know if I have Judd on here from Leo. I don't know if Judd's with us as well.
I'm right here. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Judd. All right. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to loop back. I missed Marnice Jackson. Did Marnice join us? Okay. Well,
I'm
thanks everybody.
present.
Oh, great. Thanks, Marnice. Sorry, didn't mean to go too quick. All right. Thanks, everybody. So now we're going to move into a little bit of business for us. So you received an email, I think it was last week from Kimber, from the generic climate email, which Kimber is taking care of for us, with both the agenda for today as well as with a copy of the February minutes. So we're going to do just a little bit of business to get those in front of us. So first, I'm going to ask if we can put the agenda in front of us, and then we can talk about it. So do I have someone who's willing to move and someone who's willing to second the agenda?
I'll move we accept the agenda.
Support.
Mary Graves.
Great, thank you. I got Mary and Darrell on support. And is there any discussion on the agenda that's in front of us? Let me say quickly. So we're a little council business. And then we're going to launch into the work groups right away. So we've got an introduction for you to the energy work group. And then we're going to talk a bit about energy generation, transmission, distribution, and storage, which of course is a very big topic for 90 minutes, let alone for the 45 some minutes we've crammed it into. So I know you'll bear with us as we do that. And then we'll have some open discussion at the end and then set up for our next meeting. So any discussion on the agenda that's in front of us? Great. All in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
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 Hi.
Any opposition? Thank you. So the agenda's in front of us, and before we step into it, I'd like to do the business of the minutes. So again, I'm going to ask us to put them properly in front of us, and then we can discuss. So do I have a motion and second for the minutes from February?
So moved.
Thanks, Darrell.
I will second, Tanya.
Thanks, Tanya. Okay, any discussion on the February minutes? Anything anybody saw they wanted to talk about? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Great. Well done, folks. We've done the business work. Okay. So we're going to go into the work of the agenda for today. So if we can put the slideshow back up, Brandy, if you don't mind. So for today, as I mentioned in the brief overview of the agenda, we are going to talk through energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage. And I do want to note that Obviously, this is a very big topic, and it's really tough to do it all justice. So what we're working to do is set the table for the council itself, knowing that there will be future and more detailed conversations in the work group. So I'm also going to, thank you, take us to this slide. We worked this up to help create a schematic for the ways that the work groups interact with the council, and then also to represent the connection to the other councils that exist and task forces that we're getting input from. So what you see here is you've got the energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage on the left, housing and buildings, transportation and mobility, natural working lands and forest products, and energy intensive industry. So we'll talk a bit more about the work groups a little further on, but wanted to just bring that back up for all of you as we launch into the agenda here today. And as we mentioned in the conversation at the last meeting, and as you heard from the governor's opening comments, it's important that our work be grounded in connections to entities that exist within state government. So on the left, you see our connection to the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. We affectionately refer to that one as the MACEJ because we do like our acronyms. And that is an advisory body that advises Regina Strong, our environmental justice public advocate, who you're going to hear from a little bit more later today. And also the department, the Eagle department, as well as they work with some of the other departments in state government. We mentioned last time the Climate Justice Brain Trust. We'll hear more from them as well, not in great detail on today's agenda, but just briefly. And then also staying in connection on the right-hand side with the Council on Future Mobility and Electrification. So we wanted to create this organizational chart just to try to create a little more clarity around the feedback loops. And then we're going to talk in the future too, from a timeline perspective, with a calendar to try to line up the deliverables from that perspective as well. So because of the topic of today, we're going to launch into that energy space, and that'll start us with the work group discussion. And then the work groups will, have, they'll help craft the Climate Council agendas going forward for future meetings. So for example, for the next meeting, we're going to talk about buildings and housing. So this will give us some structure to the work that we're all here doing together. So with that, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. I'm going to keep us moving because we have a lot of content for today. And I am going to introduce Commissioner Catherine Paratic from the Michigan Public Service Commission, and then Douglas Jester from Five Lakes Energy. And the two of them are the co-chairs for the energy work group. So you'll recall for the 5 work groups, each work group has 2 co-chairs, one from the state of Michigan and one an external stakeholder. So the 2 of them, so Catherine and Douglas together, are co-chairing the energy work group. And with that, I would like to hand it over to them.
Thanks, Liesl. So we should have a slide up here too to be able to describe a little bit about what we've been able to decide thus far for our work group. But first, I thought we should just introduce ourselves. So I'm Catherine Paratic. I'm the newest commissioner on the Michigan Public Service Commission, working with Chair Scripps, who's part of the council, as well as Commissioner Hill. And Douglas, do you want to provide a brief introduction as well?
Of course. This is Douglas Jester. I'm managing partner at Five Lakes Energy. We're a consultancy based in Michigan, working mostly in Michigan and across the Midwest.
No, he doesn't.
To advance
You're muted.
I lost Douglas.
I'm not sure where you lost me, but
mission.
Yes, it was.
Articulate your mission, Douglas.
Okay. Yes. So Five Lakes Energy is a consultancy, and we work to advance clean energy through economic analysis and expert testimony.
Wonderful. So Douglas and I are co-chairs of this first work group, the energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage. Not only is it a mouthful, but that is a lot of work. There's a lot that goes into, those 4 topics. So we have decided that our energy areas of focus are going to be the electrical and natural gas sectors. So propane, oil, and other forms of energy will be left to other work groups because electricity and natural gas, with those 4 focuses, is a lot to tackle. And the other work groups seem very well poised to focus on the other forms of energy. So Douglas and I have met a few times already to come up with a schedule and a structure for our work group. Our schedule, what we've decided, is Tuesday afternoons. We're going to do every other week basis with 90 minutes from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And the structure we've put a lot of thought into. We're going to have 3 phases for the structure of this work group, with the first phase being our exploratory and introductory phase, where we'll have idea presentations by major stakeholders. So we're inviting utilities and other energy producers, distributors, transmitters, and storers to come to present their ideas. And in this first phase, feedback is going to be mainly written. So we are not going to have necessarily discussion back and forth during these 90 minutes in phase 1. When we get to phase 2, this is going to be more deliberation and decision-making meetings. So we're going to take the ideas and information that came out of phase 1 to determine our topics and issues to be deliberated in phase 2. These are going to also be the same 90-minute meetings, and feedback is going to be live during these meetings. We're going to utilize the breakout rooms and note-taker reporting during these meetings to actually, get into some of the issues and have that deliberation and discussion. And then finally, once we get through some of these issues, we'll move into our final phase, which will likely be relatively short as we come to the end of our 5 to 6 month period to get this work done. Where we're looking at resolving differences and packaging our idea list for presentation to the Climate Council. Oh, and I guess I should mention our first meeting is coming up. I think it's April 6th. We've scheduled our first meeting, and we're going to hit the ground running in about 2 weeks.
Great, Catherine. Nice overview. Douglas, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you.
Great. Any questions for Catherine and Douglas? All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So just know that Catherine and Douglas are also resources for all of you. We'll now have our discussion around energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage, which I'm guessing will bring up some questions, and we certainly can entertain them from the speakers today, but also Douglas and Catherine are another great place to go. I know we have a deep amount of expertise on this council as well, and so we just want to kind of create a foundation so that we can get to the point where we're able to exchange and have greater discussion over details and moving us forward. So thanks, Catherine and Douglas, appreciate it. All right. Now I'm handing it over to Brandy to talk about evolution of energy and take us into our overview of energy generation, transmission, distribution, and storage. Dr. Brandy Brown, floor is yours.
Thank you, Director Clark. So this is just my quick short story using 2 slides to ground our thinking in the decisions that we've made as a society over the last 100 years or so. So this first slide just shows how our energy use has changed since 1776, when the United States was founded, and it only goes to 2012 because it doesn't seem like folks are trying to go all the way back to chart that course of the course of our energy consumption. But if you look here, we start using a lot of coal in the mid 1800s after primarily using wood. And so we can think about what historically happened in our society at that time, what we were building, where we were building it, who was building. And I'm going to jump forward to the 1950s, where we see much more variety in our use of different energy types, different energy fuels. And just think about the investments that we made at that time in our society. So there's a lot more building going on. There's a lot more urban sprawl. And here's my second slide. I told you this would be really short. So if we start at 1950, then we can see with a little bit more granularity up until 2019, how that energy mix changed. And so what I want everyone to take away is that the impact we've made on our energy consumption has been rather recent. We've said that before in prior discussions, but I want us all to remember that we're here to figure out what this graph should look like after that 2019 mark. So if we were to imagine this from 2021, moving forward to 2050, how do we want that mix to change? How does it need to change? So I wanted to just leave you with that. And I also want to see if Regina Strong is on the phone, on the call to chime in here if she wishes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the importance of the backdrop of what was going on in both policy and society as these energy sources gained prominence. I think we need to think a lot about why impacted communities are the impacted communities. And so thinking historically and putting in context things like redlining, which really limited where people of color could move in this country, where they lived, where the neighborhoods where they had to stay, and the proximity to a lot of the sources that we will be talking about throughout this process, I think is an important backdrop as we look at how we move forward into our next phase, lifting up those previously impacted communities and looking at how our planning takes that into account. So just wanted to add that to the context of our energy mix over time.
Thank you, Regina. And so with that thought of, this is a big change that we're striving for, but we've had a significant change over the past since the country was founded. We can make another change again. So Director Clark, back to you.
Great, thanks Brandy and Regina, appreciate that. And then we'll hear from Brandy and Regina here at the end too. So I think it's an important bookend to these conversations that we're having today. So I'm going now to introduce to you somebody who some of you may be familiar with, Doug Scott, who's with Great Plains Institute. And we've been fortunate to be working closely with Great Plains Institute as we've been crafting the work of the council. And so some of you who may have been interacting through the work group process already, maybe working with Trevor Drake and some of the others from the team at Great Plains. So we're very pleased to have GPI support the work that we're doing. And as you will all feel after you have a chance to listen to Doug, just some really great expertise here that Doug brings to the table, not only from his own professional experience, which I'll let him talk a little bit about up front, but also from the work that GPI is doing right now, involved across the Midwest, as well as involved in national steps around climate, and being in a support role in many of our other Midwestern neighbors as they're working through, what do policy agendas look like, what do legislative agendas look like, what kind of decision making is necessary in order to take us forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug, and hope that we have some. He'll do a great job presenting, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion a little bit later. Doug?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Director. Great to be with you. And on behalf of GPI, we're thrilled to be working with you and this wonderful group, charting Michigan's path going forward. As Director Clark said, we do work with a lot of states, both on decarbonization efforts, on utility business model as that fits in, on transmission. We work on biofuels and electric vehicles as well as with communities. So we really do a lot of work in this area, and so we're thrilled to be with you today. Since Director Clark said I would, I will tell you briefly that I've been with Great Plains for about 6 years, but prior to that, the last 10 years I spent split between being chair of the Illinois Commission that regulates utilities, and before that with the as head of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. So all these issues are related, and we're gonna go very quickly today. There's a lot here. This will be really high level for some of you, so I apologize for that in advance. And we could talk about any of these issues for hours. The work group that Commissioner Paratek and Douglas talked about, they will talk about it for hours, and then we will at the council as well. But wanted to just kind of level set here. We'll go very quickly on a really high level because that's what the steering committee wanted here. So we'll move forward, and then I will turn it over in a few minutes to Chairman Scripps to talk about more detail on transmission issues. So if we can go to the next slide. So pass. There we go. Thank you very much. So, and you got this already in a wonderful, the two slides that Dr. Brown gave you, but as you could see from that, a lot of coal, a lot of power was derived, and the power sector was derived from coal before it became, working on natural gas or nuclear power, which developed over time, largely because it was cheap and reliable. We had mostly central station power generation. It was very cost effective. Power flowed one direction from the station through the distribution lines to the customers. As gas and nuclear developed again, but that was mostly central station and one-way power flow as well. And the goal of that system was to electrify the United States, and it worked. It was to bring power everywhere throughout the country and to do it as cost effectively as possible. And it wasn't so much, obviously, it wasn't thinking about environmental impacts as much. It wasn't thinking about anything other than mostly reliability and cost. But as you just heard from Regina, it also ended up with a system that had a very much a disproportionate impact on people of color and on folks with low income, especially as the real estate trends developed that Regina talked about. You ended up with a lot more negative health impacts for low income folks and for people of color. They're getting additional health impacts from things like living around factories, living where there's high emissions from transportation as well. So that's something that we're very interested in focusing on as this process goes forward. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to credit for the next 3 slides. I'm going to thank Douglas Jester, the co-chair of this committee, from a presentation that he made. And I'll go through these fairly quickly, but just to point out a couple of things that are important at a high level. I think the important thing from this, you'll see this is national numbers, but transportation has now overtaken electricity as of 2018 in terms of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. But all 5 of the slices of the pie chart there are represented in work groups so we're going to be looking at all of these different sectors as we go forward. Next slide, please. And this, again, just talks about a little bit of Michigan's CO2 emissions, the carbon emissions. You'll see that a large portion of that comes from electric power. The largest portion in Michigan comes from electric power, with transportation a little bit behind it. And I've got some other numbers to look at this also. One of the things that this work group and then the council are going to have to look at is the fact that coal plants have been retiring and have been replaced in many cases by renewables, in many cases by natural gas. And so a lot of the gains that have been made in terms of emission reductions over the last few years have been realized already. And so the question becomes, if the nuclear plants stay in operation, that creates one variable for us to think about. If they start to retire and need to be replaced by renewables, that becomes very much something that we want to try to figure out how we can ramp the renewable energy up to meet that the reduction goals that we have. If we go to the next slide, really quickly, I just want you to focus on the second to last column on the right. because those are the electric power sector, and that's the sector that we're talking about here. And you can look at the emissions from both coal and natural gas. Look at the difference between 2005 and 2017, where the emissions from natural gas have increased, but coal has dropped dramatically. And that was evident in that last slide that we saw as well. So some of the things we'll talk about as we go forward here today is what that means and what it means for the natural gas sector and what it means for emissions overall. If we go to the next slide. So why are things different now? What are the drivers of change? And again, these are not Michigan specific. These are things that are happening all over the world, really, but certainly all over the United States. One is technology changes. I'll get into that in a little more detail in just a couple of minutes. The cost of renewable energy, as we all know, has dropped dramatically. People don't everywhere look at this as just a climate initiative. They look at it as an economic development tool. There are some very red states that we've worked with in the past that have doubled or even tripled down on trying to incent renewable energy. They're not doing it for climate reasons. They're doing it because they want to try to attract the Googles and Amazons and the large customers who are insisting on having 100% clean energy. So the cheaper electricity from renewables used to be that we had to think about it from for climate reasons. We had to think about it in terms of saying, well, yes, it may be more expensive, but there are all the climate benefits. Now you're seeing people that are getting into it because it's the cheaper form of electricity in many places. And you're seeing a lot of utilities make those same decisions as well. Customer preferences is very important. Mentioned the Googles and Amazons of the world, but all customer classes, for the most part, are looking for cleaner sources of energy. They want that cleaner energy to be part of their mix. Cost of natural gas went low and stayed low. As you could see from the previous chart, that meant that natural gas became a replacement for coal in many instances at roughly half of the greenhouse gas emissions if you just look at it from a smokestack basis. There are other issues with natural gas as well that folks will get into. But a lot of the retirements of coal have happened not for environmental reasons, they've happened for market reasons. They've happened because natural gas got much cheaper and renewables got much cheaper. And that's had an impact on coal plants being able to bid into the market and being economically able to survive. That's also had an impact on the nuclear plants as well. And then there are other environmental reasons that are not greenhouse gas related. So for example, things like the Mercury and Air Toxics Act and all of the extra equipment that coal-fired power plants would have to install on their plants to account for criteria pollutants like nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and mercury. Those added expenses have also added to the economics of the coal plants. Coal ash requirements, all of the coal plants from one company in Illinois have decided to retire, and the reason they cited was because of the extra precautions that they're going to need to make with respect to storing coal ash on their property going forward. So there are a lot of different things that are driving this. If we go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time, but just on any of these, but just to kind of tick off some of the reasons why new technologies are assisting in decarbonization. We talk about storage, obviously is now, and will continue to be an even greater assistance to renewable energy, especially if we get to the point where we have long-term storage technology instead of just a few hours of storage. Things like advanced nuclear plants are being discussed, and there's new research coming out all the time on things like advanced nuclear, things like hydrogen technology, decarbonization of end-use natural gas. There are a lot of these technologies that are being worked on right now, as well as carbon capture and storage. A lot of people think about that as just for coal plants. It could also be for gas. There are many cost factors that are inhibiting that development right now, but there has been federal legislation to try to provide incentives to develop carbon capture or direct air capture kind of plants, and I think that's likely to continue. It seems to have pretty well bipartisan support in Congress to try to develop these initiatives for carbon capture. If we go to the next slide. A lot more in terms of distributed generation. We think of it in terms of maybe the solar people put on the rooftops, but it's also things like demand response and being able to use rate design and shave the peak loads off that will allow not only cost savings for customers, but will also make sure that we're not using power on peak as much, more costly. In many cases, much more environmentally detrimental because you're talking about peaker plants. They only run for a short period of time. In many places, they tend to be dirtier plants in terms of their emissions. And so being able to use distributed generation to shave those peak times becomes very important from an environmental basis as well as from a cost basis. There's a lot that the buildings group is going to talk about in terms of energy efficiency. I just put it up here because it's obviously something that's going to be very important going forward. I do want to touch briefly on the heat pumps, the last piece of energy efficiency. This has to do more with electrification. This has to do more with changing over in the building sector, more from coal-fired from natural gas heating to things like electric heating. And if we do that, something like heat pump technology is going to become very important as well. Next slide, please. Chairman Scripps is going to talk about this in greater detail, but obviously how power gets bought and sold on the market in a wholesale fashion is very, very important to all of our efforts here in Michigan and in other places to try to work on decarbonization. We could spend hours talking about the evolution of regional transmission organizations. They basically built up as instruments to ensure greater reliability and to lower cost by making sure that if you're distributing power over a larger and larger area, different areas have different needs at different times and different resources that they can bring to the mix, and it's been found over time to be more efficient and to be part of a larger market. Michigan's actually in two larger markets, both in MISO and in PJM. They have different market rules. They treat things like distributed energy different. They talk about capacity and reliability issues differently, and they have different fuel mixes. And one of the things that you're starting to see now is that the grids are becoming cleaner. And in fact, the Southwest Power Pool on March 14th, over 80% of their electricity was renewable energy at that particular time. And how do we include distributed energy resources into the mix? If we go to the next slide, we talk about what other states are doing. The United States Climate Alliance, response to the U.S. Leaving the Paris Accords. Michigan's one of over half the states that are part of the Climate Alliance, as are several of your neighbors. There are governor's targets in a number of your neighboring states. Illinois is developing comprehensive legislation to try to meet those targets right now. Minnesota and Wisconsin are developing clean energy plans. There's modeling going on right now to determine how to do some greater greenhouse gas reductions. What might those entail? Are there something like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that might involve a larger carbon market? There are numerous states with ambitious goals throughout the country, and one thing that every other state is talking about, as we are here and as we already have today, the issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, not just in terms of how we've talked about it in terms of the areas and the disproportionate impact on low income, but also in terms of how the new energy economy can help benefit people who have traditionally not been able to experience the benefits of the energy economy. Going forward on the next slide, I'll do the last two slides fairly quickly. There's obviously a federal administration that will play a large role in what we do here. There's a clean slate right now. There's no clean power plan, no affordable clean energy role. That's been done through the courts. However, the US EPA is obviously a consideration, is looking at climate, as is every other federal agency. The new administration has elevated climate, not only in the White House, but also, and not just at EPA, but also in every agency of the federal government. President Biden has rejoined the Paris Agreement. We're supposed to get new targets in a month around Earth Day. And then the question becomes, what is going to be, what new plan is going to be coming either from the administration and probably maybe less likely from Congress in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gases, and what do we develop here in Michigan that'll help us be able to react to that as well. And the last slide, just some quick additional thoughts if we're thinking about this area. You know, do we look at the power sector, because we know how to get the reductions out of the power sector? Do we give that an oversized role to enable decarbonization in other sectors that are maybe a little bit more difficult, like some of the industrial sector, or maybe in buildings? Do we get more in terms of electrification and decarbonization of the power sector? And then as we move to electrification, can the grid handle everything that we need to do in terms of electrification? What are some things that we need to think about there? What are the transmission needs going to be? And if we're moving away from a natural gas infrastructure in terms of buildings, what happens to that infrastructure on natural gas? What do we do with that? And with all of it, what are the costs and what are the impact on the customers? And the last thing I'll leave you with, if you didn't get this idea already, that this isn't easy. There are a ton of moving parts, a ton of things to keep in mind at all times. And so this work, while very important, is also very difficult. And so the work that you're doing on the council is going to be extremely important moving forward to help provide the right framework so that Michigan can meet their decarbonization goals. And with that, let me introduce Chairman Dan Scripps of the Michigan Commission. And Chairman Scripps is going to talk a little bit more about the Michigan perspective and also a little bit deeper dive on some of the transmission issues. So, Chairman.
Thanks, Doug. You are a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak on this. I want to give an overview of essentially how we approach energy planning in Michigan. This will largely be on the power sector, and I'll note that at the end as well, that we are doing some planning on transportation in terms of road mapping, where electric vehicle charging infrastructure might be best placed, and some other things. We have we have a lot of oversight, obviously, of the natural gas system, and have worked closely with the utilities on their plans. But our formal planning infrastructure is largely focused on the power sector. So next slide, and we can get into this. I will acknowledge at the beginning that these are very wordy slides. I am not going to go over everything, but I wanted to make sure that they could be a resource as we sort of walk away from this meeting and have an opportunity to digest. But in 2016, the legislature enacted a pair of public acts that added a requirement that regulated electric utilities do integrated resource planning, looking out at energy and capacity needs 5, 10, and 15 years into the future. This was strongly bipartisan legislation built on our existing regulatory framework, and also provided a fair amount of discretion to the commission and flexibility to adapt as we go forward. Former Governor Rick Snyder called this a no regrets energy strategy that would be adaptable as time passed. So in building their integrated resource plans, the utilities look at a whole range of things and include everything from long-term forecasts around their sales and peak demand, the amount that they will get from renewable resources and cogeneration, CHP units, looking at energy waste reduction, including annual energy waste reduction projections, and including a focus on transmission options. So really taking a comprehensive look at where they are and where they expect to go. In evaluating the plans, we also have a fair amount of flexibility. We need to approve the plans if we find that they are, quote, the most reasonable and prudent, means of meeting the utility's energy and capacity needs 5, 10, and 15 years into the future. And within that, it's not any one factor that's considered. It's not the least cost, it's not the most reliable. It's sort of how well the utility balances a range of things, including price, reliability, commodity price risk, diversification of generation supply, and cost effectiveness of the energy waste reduction. Notably, it simply exceeding the renewable energy or energy waste reduction goals is not evidence of unreasonableness. And in fact, we've completed the first round of these IRPs. We completed the last of them last year, and we'll start the second round this year. And what we found is that in balancing price and reliability and other things, we're seeing utility plans that far exceed statutory minimums on renewable energy and energy waste reduction to the benefit of the ultimate customers. I think we can go to the next slide. We also, in Michigan, do some distribution system planning, which sort of has the same goal, optimizing utility investment decisions. And I would say this is increasingly important. It used to be that we spent the most of the sort of total bill on generation and the like. We're now seeing that is flipping, and that most of the bill is being spent on the distribution system. It's driven by needs to replace aging infrastructure and improve reliability. In 2018, we thought we needed greater transparency. Typically, these investments are reviewed as part of the utility rate cases. But in 2018, we said, following a technical conference, that we'd like to see 5-year distribution plans from the utilities, starting with our two largest ones, DTE and Consumers, and then in 2019, adding Indiana, Michigan. We don't currently require distribution plans for the other utilities, but this allows a greater understanding of how proposed investments tie to long-term strategies. It allows the opportunity for stakeholders beyond the utilities and the commission and our staff to comment. Though unlike IRPs, we don't conduct these as contested cases. So there's an opportunity for comment, but not discovery and getting evidence and that sort of thing. And also, we don't approve these, so they are filed with us. But unlike IRPs, we don't approve the utility distribution plans. Instead, the specific investments are still reviewed through rate cases. The distribution plans just give us a better context to understand what's being proposed. Next slide, please. We, in 2019, to build on the distribution planning effort, we launched a multi-year effort that we have dubbed My Power Grid. And this is intended to maximize the benefits of the transition to clean distributed energy resources for Michigan residents and businesses. We spend a lot of time torturing the metaphor of the bus at the commission. And to Doug's point, we don't see ourselves as driving this transition. It's happening because of technology increases, price declines, customer demands, climate awareness, and a number of other factors. But we also don't want to be run over by the bus. We absolutely see it as important to make sure that we're anticipating where the system's going and making sure that we're ready for it. So our initial focus was really on foundational issues, interconnection, service quality rules, looking at the demand response framework. A lot of this built off of, as well, the statewide energy assessment that was conducted in 2019 following the polar vortex, and making sure that we're ready and resilient as sort of severe weather events increase. We're now in phase 2 that looks at competitive procurement, new technologies and business models, and advanced planning. And we're preparing for the second round of distribution plans for Consumers Energy, DTE, and Indiana, Michigan that'll be filed this summer. One of the interesting things coming out of the IRP process is that a number of the investments that were proposed in the near term by the utilities actually took place on the distribution system, energy waste reduction, and demand response. And so we're also seeing a need to try and integrate resource planning and distribution planning. Consumers Energy is working to align its IRP and distribution plans that it'll file this summer. And Northern States Power, which serves the Western Upper Peninsula, has agreed to do the same as part of its next IRP. I think we can keep going. We also have a number of other processes. We need to update our planning parameters and filing requirements every 5 years, which is an ongoing process. Notably, following Governor Whitmer's announcement of the My Healthy Climate Plan, our advanced planning work group came up with a framework for considering carbon reduction goals within the planning process. And last month, we issued an order requiring the utilities to model what it would take. So I'm not sure that we can require them to adhere to the goals set out in the My Healthy Climate Plan, but we can, I think, get a sense of how it would impact their plans if they were to achieve those goals. And not surprisingly, given what Doug said and some of what we heard from stakeholders, we expect the power sector is going to need to overperform the 2025 targets in order to get to our economy-wide emissions reduction targets in 2025. And then the other harder to decarbonize sectors, transportation, buildings, industry, will sort of do more of their work as we look towards 2050. There's still questions as to how much. We've set initial targets for those 3 utilities that will file their second IRPs in 2021. And my hope is that this group actually can help inform our work in terms of the targets to be achieved by the utilities further out, including sort of the addition of that information into those planning parameters and filing requirements. We also have an ongoing study to update the potential of energy waste reduction and demand response, again required by statute, and we expect that this project will be completed by August. And then the Michigan Senate last year also requested that we conduct a study to consider various rate design options around distributed generation. We launched that earlier this month with a stakeholder session, and we'll have that done by October. Next slide, please. As Doug said, we could spend a lot of time that we don't have today on transmission planning, but a couple of things to note. First, resource and distribution planning are very much within the jurisdiction of the state. Transmission planning, though, happens at the RTO level with MISO and PJM. And RTOs, with the exception of ERCOT, as we've all learned in the last couple of months, operate under the jurisdiction of the federal government, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they're not subject to state jurisdiction. I'd note that MISO, which is the RTO that most of Michigan, except for the far southwest corner of the Lower Peninsula, which is served by Indiana, Michigan, and is in the PJM interconnect. But MISO has recently launched a long-range transmission planning process, looking at what it would take from the transmission build-out to accommodate some of the changes that we're seeing in the electricity industry, including the generation fleet change with a lot of coal retirements and the addition of a lot of renewables in order to maintain reliability into the future. And this is a huge task that they've taken on. I think it's important and very relevant to our discussion here in terms of what the results of that look like. We also asked MISO in 2019, again following the statewide energy assessment, to examine transmission constraints that limit power flows into and out of Michigan. They are working on this capacity import-export limit study, and we expect the final results very soon, in the next couple of weeks even. But the idea is, how do we make more use and full use of the larger transmission system, again, as Doug talked about, to ensure reliability and give us a hedge as our fleet change continues. And then finally, we are working to integrate transmission planning into state processes. As I mentioned earlier, the IRP statute requires consideration of transmission. The RTO processes also require consideration of non-transmission alternatives. And we participated, along with the State Energy Office, in a multi-year NARUC-NASIO, these are our 2 national organizations, task force on comprehensive electricity planning, looking at how do we align and integrate resource, transmission, and distribution planning so that we're getting a whole look. And that blueprint and our state action plans were released last month. And then I think this is my last slide, just in terms of highlighting a couple of some of the challenges or limits. So first of all, the IRP process, I think, is working really well. I think that the legislature really got it right in 2016, and it's an adaptable framework. The one challenge that does come up, and it's inherent, is that these are utility resource plans, individual utilities, and we're not necessarily looking across jurisdictional or service territory boundaries. We also don't account for the planning done by municipal and cooperative utilities. They're not under our jurisdiction. It doesn't mean that they're not planning, but it means that we don't have the level of oversight with the commission. We're not asking for it, but it's just sort of the limitations given the jurisdictional issues. There's also, as I mentioned, increasing overlap between generation, transmission, and distribution planning. But when those operate under different jurisdictions, some under FERC, federal government jurisdiction, others under state government, different business models where Michigan utilities own generation and obviously operate the distribution system, but transmission has been spun off to independent transmission operators. Some of those jurisdictional and business model issues create challenges on both the transmission planning and the resource and distribution planning side. I mentioned that this is largely focused on the power sector, and there are significant differences between the electricity and gas sectors that add complexity to gas system planning. And then finally, our planning to date considers a whole host of things, but we're at the end of the day economic regulators. And so both at the commission level and the RTO level, there aren't clear hooks to consider climate change or GHG emissions. We can have the utilities think about them and model them, but these aren't optimized for GHG reductions. We've seen a huge amount of GHG reductions on economic basis as the fleet transitions, but that's not sort of part of the core, and it's not written in statute in terms of what our overview looks at. So that is a huge amount of territory between Doug and I to cover, and I'll stop now, and I know that there's probably discussions and questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you, Dan. First, I'm going to say, I know that we have a diverse group of council members, and so I suspect that there are people who IRP and RTOs roll off their tongues, and there are people that are like, what's a regional transmission operator, and how does that integrate into our energy systems? So I know that that was a whole lot of information. I'm also going to say that all of the material for these meetings is on the council website that I put in the link. So you can pull down the presentation from last time, and we'll post the recordings and the materials from this time up there as well. We don't post the meeting minutes until after they're approved. So that's why you don't see the minutes from the first meeting. They'll get up there now. So with that, I'm going to see if we've got questions for Dan and Doug, and if we can try to keep Dan and Doug our answers kind of at the high level for the purposes of today's discussion, knowing that the work group is going to be another good place to work out more of the details when it comes to the energy world. So if folks have questions, feel free to use the raise hand function. That probably is the easiest way. And let me re-articulate too. Sorry, I should have said this up front. The question and answer portion is for council members only. So please, if you could let the council members ask the questions. Thank you. Any questions? All right, and I see a hand up. Ron, floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. Obviously, yeah, a lot of information. I'm probably on the side of not knowing all the acronyms and activities here, but obviously there's an intrinsic link between all the, let's say, building and housing interconnect with the energy, just generation and distribution. I think you guys talked a lot as far as if we look at efficiency role in playing in there, as far as generation and transmission. The aspects of, let's say, distributed energy, especially. Could you comment a little bit on, I don't see as much focus, at least in these couple slides, on, the use of time and virtual, let's say, means, if you will. What I'm trying to say, there's time of use or some of these other aspects of virtual battery and/or opportunities and demand and response addressable loads as well within this plan. As far as that goes. So just maybe comment a little bit on that.
It's a great question. Doug, do you want to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Chairman.
Okay. So we are starting to do a lot of this in Michigan. Consumers is in the process of moving to fully integrate a time of use or time-based pricing for their customers. DTE has plans in place that we've approved in terms of pilots. Some of this has been paused a little bit through COVID and the changing sort of consumption patterns and wanting to be sensitive about sort of making changes when it looks different than it has previously. But I think it is moving in that direction. And then we also have an ongoing work group that is on new technologies and business models that's looking at some of these things as well, in terms of how some of those sort of flexible demand pieces can fit in. And so there's been a fair amount of work through the My Power Grid initiative on looking at some of these things and how we then integrate and then scale them in the state. But it's certainly part of the equation. I will say that the demand response and flexible load pieces were identified as both, something that was super useful in the response to the polar vortex, but also that we needed to get tighter around and making sure that resources that we thought were there are actually showing up when called upon. And so we've spent a fair amount of time both on sort of the large scale demand response and then really starting to think about how to aggregate it at the through the utility or otherwise at the sort of residential level in order to make sure that we're sort of skating to where the puck's going, if you will.
Thank you.
Pack?
Hi, that was terrific. And I am one who is also just learning a lot of the acronyms in your field of expertise, but I really appreciate your overview. I just wondered if you could take a step back and help us understand how what you just discussed fits into what we really need to do in the greater sense of mapping out how does a state of Michigan go carbon neutral by 2050. And you've said that the IRP process isn't set up to optimize across utilities, and of course, there's more to it than just energy generation, electricity generation. How are we going to? I mean, what are your ideas on how we chart out a timeline for carbon neutrality in this state, and what you can bring to the table with respect to electricity generation? I mean, are we going to get DTE and consumers really on board with this process and the other utilities, or are they going to continue to try and slow it down?
So, Doug, I want to see if you have thoughts, having worked through this process with other states, and then maybe I can speak just briefly to some commission thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Peck, you're really well set up here in terms of the work groups that you've got to look at what each sector needs to do, to the point that Chairman Scripps made, and I made it too, about maybe you overperform in some areas because it's a little bit more difficult. So I think each of the work groups is going to be able to kind of understand, first of all, what their emissions are, then what they would need to do to kind of play their part going forward. And then the council then will have the ability, and we'll try to help with that as well, to show where there are cross issues, where one area needs to, because this isn't all siloed, as you point out, it's all interrelated. So where are those cross issues where one sector can help out another sector? So that's some of the things that we'll be able to do, and we'll be able to show, in terms of a timeline, what each sector would need to do. And, to the power sector work group, Douglas Jester has done a lot of really good work on that very issue of kind of showing what each of the areas will need to do. As to what, with respect to particular utilities and things like that, I'll leave that to the policymakers. But these are the same questions that come up in all of the different places that we work. The numbers are different, the players are different, but the issues are still the same. So I think we'll be able to give you some pretty good options and bring that in front of you. And then you tell us what you think makes the most sense for Michigan.
And I'll just say briefly that I think we're fortunate that our major utilities have targets that are consistent with what the governor's articulated. Consumers and DTE both net zero across both their businesses, sort of in the 2040-2050 timeline. I&M announced, or their parent company, earlier this week, a climate scenario analysis that will get them to net zero by 2050 as well. UP utilities have similar targets through their ownership structures. So I think we're rowing in the same direction. And then to Doug's point, I think part of the challenge in the IRP is sort of what does load growth look like as you start to decarbonize other sectors by moving them to electrification, transportation, and buildings and that. And then what are the other pieces, whether it's hydrogen or renewable natural gas or other things that can play a role. But we want to make sure that the sort of load numbers are right so that we're not overbuilding the infrastructure or the generation if our assumptions turn out not to be, but also that the grid is not the bottleneck that stops us from achieving our economy-wide aims.
Good discussion. I'm going to let Phil ask one more so that we can get to Regina, and then I suspect Dan and Doug will also, and I know Doug will, and I'm going to sign Dan up to take questions when we get to our open discussion part of the agenda too. So Phil, if you want to ask a question, then we'll.
Yeah, I'll say it now. It goes a little bit beyond just our sector here, but it's, I think what you just said, Doug, kind of made it seem like it was a good time to ask this. Tell me if that's not the case. So the work groups for this initiative are really around verticals, but you have some issues that have potentially big climate impacts, carbon impacts like water and water use and recycling. And I'm just curious, and actually a couple of people have asked me this, where do those fit into this? Are they within the context of each individual sector, or how are they dealt with?
There will be some that will be in individual sectors that you'll need, that you'll want to look at. So for example, when we start talking about energy usage, things like, water and wastewater plants become huge energy users that need to be talked about in that context. But then there may also be issues that we'll need to look at on more of a cross-cutting example. And so if something comes up in one work group where the issue makes sense to be dealt with in the other work group, we'll make sure we do that as well. So I think there are issues that, ultimately things like recycling, what do we do with the different areas? Obviously all things we'd like to deal with in the work groups where we can. There may be some issues that on a cross-cutting level will be brought to you and brought to the council to try to figure out what's the best way to handle it. But I don't know if Director Clark or Dan, if you wanted to add to that.
I think that is a good answer, and I do think there are going to be things that come up to the council. But Phil, you're raising a good point. Those horizontals are an important part of what we do, and we have had a lot of discussions about those horizontals in the meantime. So, I was a little hesitant about the kind of busy schematic at the beginning because there's so much intersectionality with this work. I hope not use an overused term already, but there is so many factors that are at play. So we'll work through that together.
Great, thank you.
So, yeah, you're welcome. So this is good discussion too for kind of the open discussion part of what we wanted to do today, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk equity and EJ first. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Regina Strong, who you heard from already. And before I hand it over to her, because she came after Brandy before, I just want to say how much I really value working with Regina. I feel very privileged to be on this journey together. So anyway, with that, I'll hand it off to Regina, who's our environmental justice public advocate at EVIL.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that intro. And it's very interesting hearing you talk about the intersectionality of all of this work. Is such an important piece that leads us to kind of the equity and really justice part of the conversation. Because as Phil pointed out, there are a lot of things that cut across, right? And need to be integrated in all of the conversations. And equity and energy justice, really thinking about how do we work through this process and incorporate a lens of equity. You'll hear it all the time, but how do we actually do it? And I want to just give some context around the conversation, and hopefully we'll have many more in terms of as we move forward on that. So we can go to the next slide. I'm going to keep this relatively brief, but I just wanted to go back to something that many of you may have heard before. But really the reasons that justice and equity are an important part of the planning process that we're embarking on, and why they need to be priorities in the planning. You heard from Doug earlier. I referenced it when I talked about redlining. Many of the detrimental effects associated with energy generation have impacted historically over time communities, low-income communities and communities of color. And so just as the impact, both environmental and economic, have had, in some cases, really disparate and dire impacts on communities, as we look to plan toward really a new energy economy, as we look toward how we generate energy in the future, we need to be inclusive of communities that before now have been, the home to our industrial past, the home to many of the ways that we generated energy in the past, but have often, more often than not benefited from the economic side of it. So you'll hear a lot on the justice side in terms of really equity and impact. But I think opportunity should be added to that part of the conversation, because I think there's really opportunity to address, some of the things that impact communities negatively, things like the energy burden, things like, how do we, look at health impacts? How do we look at all those things? And there are a couple things in the works that I think will help us take a look from the perspective of our planning. One of the things, when you heard Dan talk about the integrated resource planning process, and the EGLE staff and the PSC staff are working right now on how do we incorporate an environmental justice analysis into that process. And so we're not just looking at the economic model, but also looking at what those potential impacts could be of what utilities are planning moving forward. And so the opportunity to really integrate, equity into what we do is so important, and so important in this part of the planning process. I think, the historical side of advocacy, as many of you, who know me from my advocacy side, hence the public advocacy piece. But throughout, time over the last several decades, frontline communities, advocates have really pushed for that incorporation. And I think we have a really great opportunity now moving forward to figure out how to get that done, to figure out, as we embark on this brave new world, how we incorporate equity. And so I think for every work group, we're talking about energy now, there'll be other opportunities. I think for every work group, we have an opportunity here to look at how the work that we will be doing will bring opportunity to lessen impacts on communities. And so this slide really just kind of talks about what our priorities should be, and it should really be having an impact on those desperate pieces. You heard, I think in the last meeting, about the Climate Justice Brain Trust, which is made up of members of the MACEJ, 5 members of the MACEJ, and I'll say it's the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, because I know how it is to sit in a meeting and hear 5 million acronyms and not know what they all mean. So I'll go back to that. And I purposely thought MACEJ would work better than the MACEJ, because that just didn't flow. And so giving it a word often makes me remember it better. But I think the work of the Brain Trust and the MACEJ is so important in bringing the lived experiences, the opportunity to find intersections in doing this work. And I'm going to see if Justin Onweno, who is the liaison from the MACEJ, who's part of this body, and is also part of the MACEJ, is on. And Justin, I didn't know if there was anything, if you are on, that you want to add in terms of the description of the work and the opportunity.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for having me. Like she mentioned, my name is Justin Onwenu with the MACEJ, but also with the Sierra Club, the Environmental Justice Program. And I think all the things that you mentioned are really important, especially connecting the issues that we're talking about to redlining and other equity and justice issues. One of the stats that I like to give just to show how urgent a lot of these issues around energy justice are is Michigan, the state of Michigan, is the worst state in the country when it comes to energy burden. We're up there with Alabama, with Maine, with Alaska, with West Virginia. And a lot of that has to do with redlining, but also our housing stock and a lot of other issues. So I hope that in the conversations that you all are having, whether it be in work groups or in the work that you do every day, that you all are thinking about creative solutions that are going to impact people's pocketbooks. So energy burden in particular. And the second issue, I think that has to be a part of the conversation and all of the different aspects of the work is the health impact of a lot of these sources of energy that we're talking about. So health impact, energy burden, I think are just really important. And we should be thinking about ways to integrate that in all of the work that we're doing, whether it be in energy or in other areas and the work groups that we're going to be working through. So thanks again for having me, Regina.
Thank you, Justin, for adding that element to the conversation. I think that was really important. And so I know that we're in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, so I really want to leave time for that open discussion piece. And if there are any questions for me after this, portion of the presentation, we can just merge those into the open discussion portion. So thank you.
Thanks, Regina. And I was hoping that you would be willing to take questions during open portion. So it's kind of opportunities to ask questions of all our experts, but certainly Brandy, Regina, Dan, and Doug. So I'm going to turn it over. Oh, we've got a question. Jarrell, if you want to ask a question first, then I'm going to hand it over to Doug, who's going to kind of moderate our open discussion session.
Sure. Thank you, Director Clark. I just wanted to make a comment. I just wanted to uplift all the work that Regina and Justin have been doing. And just want to say whatever solution that we come out in these different sectors, for me, I definitely think that the conversation around how we can provide these recommendations in an equitable and just way, like that absolutely has to be at the forefront of any solutions that we come up with. For me, that is like a non-starter. We have to get that right. If we're going to present these recommendations. So, but just wanted to uplift the work that they're doing, that we absolutely need to make sure that is a central part of the work or the recommendation that we come up with. So.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. Appreciate that. And totally agree, by the way, but appreciate that.
Great, Doug, I think I'll hand it to you.
Thanks, Director. So for the next, say 12 minutes before we just do a final wrap up here, either questions that you have for anybody who has spoken, or other than a glossary, what are some things that would be helpful to you in terms of materials? What would you like to study up more on? What are some things either from if there's data or other requests that you've got, what are some things that would be helpful to you going forward, or any questions that you might have for anybody who is here, or ideas that you have for the power sector work group going forward? Now everybody's shy. There we go. Start with Peck and then Cynthia Williams.
Yeah, one thing I'm not is shy, and I don't mind being shut down if I talk too much either, because I think I try and talk too much. But I'd be real interested in thinking about how we might start really thinking of the horizontals, and of course I think the working groups will be the ones who will start identifying all of those interconnections with the other working groups. But it'd be really fascinating to create maybe a Google Doc that starts to really document these things so we can see them as soon as someone thinks of them, and then make sure that everyone deals with them, but also maybe start to get resources to understand the background associated with them.
Great suggestion. Thank you. Cynthia, and then Brandon.
Yes, thanks. One question, you referenced a document, Blueprint for State Action, that was embedded into one of the presentations. So if there's information like that, you could also provide in a SharePoint or something like that we could get access to that information and even a summary of what the recommendations from those documents are would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
Very good, thank you. We have talked internally about at the steering committee level about trying to create not just obviously the glossary as was mentioned, but also kind of a library of resources that would be most helpful. And that's why, we take your suggestion to heart. It's something we want to do. And so again, if people have suggestions about what materials might be helpful to them, let us know, and we'll be happy to try to accommodate that as best we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brandon Hoffmeister and then Ron.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Two suggestions just as the power sector work group starts its work for things that I think are real opportunities. And one is more of a question. I think there's an opportunity, Dan mentioned, Chairman Scripps mentioned that, the utilities have some pretty bold and aggressive goals for decarbonization. But as we heard both from you, Doug, and last week from the speaker from WRI, there is going to be the need for some new technology to be commercialized to truly achieve zero carbon. And our sector is unique in that the utility sector the regulatory model isn't really traditionally set up to do research and development and deployment. We're great at deploying scale when it comes to commercially viable technologies. The utilities can invest at scale very well. But there's not really much incentive for us. And in fact, there's some, I would say, regulatory disincentives to invest in technologies that aren't yet commercial. And so I think that's going to be something, what's the role of the federal government there? What's the role of the state and the utilities? I think that'll be an interesting thing to chart our path on. And then one other point just to put a marker on is, given the complexity of our interaction with MISO, I think we'll want to think through how we account for the emissions from our power sector. There's not yet consensus in our industry on, are we looking at just the direct emissions from power plants within the borders of the state of Michigan, or for Consumers Energy and BTE, for example, we buy and sell all of our power into that MISO market every day. Right. And we have less control over the emissions profile of the market-based purchases. And so I think we want to be careful about carbon leakage, where we might reduce emissions from direct utility-owned facilities, but we might just be importing emissions from somewhere else. So that's a wrinkle to this that I think we just need to figure out what is our best thinking on how to address that. Thanks.
Those are great points, and some of the modeling that I mentioned may help us with the leakage question. And as I'm saying that, I'm realizing leakage is probably one of those terms I'm going to need to help define for folks as well as we go forward. But that's a great suggestion, Brandon, and it obviously something to keep in mind, as well as what the what's happening at the RTO level in terms of how they're starting to view the carbon mix of their generation supply. So there's a lot that goes into that, but very good suggestions. Thank you. Dr. Phyllis Meadows. And then Ron Vogelwait. I apologize, Ron.
Ron is next. Oh, okay. Should I go?
Yep, go please, Dr. Meadows, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm one of those people that is at the way back on the back end of all the acronyms, but I'm really enjoying it. I really enjoyed the presentations, and I always wonder if am I getting it, or am I just so confused that I think I got it? But anyway, thank you guys for the presentation. I just have 4 quick points that I wanted to lift up. And one is, when I hear grid, I think infrastructure, and just wondering if and where we will be taking into account if there are land issues. How do we make sure that we're doing equitable use of land, and that we're being very thoughtful about that, and even displacement issues as we move forward, because my sense is historically those have been some of the issues that have faced especially low-income communities historically. And I would love at some point, as part of the council, if we could get some overview of those inequities, so that we're clear about what, in fact, we want to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again going forward. You know, with this mission. The third thing is, this to me seems like a great opportunity. I was responding to one of my colleagues here who mentioned the health impacts. This might be a really good opportunity to do a health impact assessment. And I'm not sure if it makes sense each work group or if it's something we do collectively as we move towards finalizing solutions, but we do need to be explicit about the impacts and not leave this with knowing that there will be some, but we don't know what they are. And then the last thing that I would say, while I don't have any insights into the deep technological processes and the economic processes that are going to be necessary to move in this direction, I think we do need to make sure with something this important that we have some periodic evaluation of impact and not wait until we get to the end game. So those are the things that I would share. And I would be welcoming any readings, deep readings on anything that you think our experts think are would be helpful to the novice mind. I'll appreciate that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I've got 3 more folks in the queue, and we'll at least get your comments. Start with Ron Vogelwade. If I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, and then Carrie Dugan would be next. So, Ron.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. I think what would be helpful as well, if we look, this is a fairly broad working group, and it has a lot of intersectionality, as we all mentioned before with the other groups. I think something for me is when we look at the different levers across the generation, storage, transmission, those type of things, along with flexible, is what is kind of the emissions intensity, kind of looking at that long-term roadmap of how we get there. What is that cost per dollar, trade-off? And I think that comes to the equitableness of these different solutions as well. So what are their applications? If we look at burden, I'd love to see a little bit more info on the energy burden. I know that's something, there's some recent work on the water side as far as water burden that was done in Detroit, and some other things that actually pointed to some very good targeted solutions and different things that could be addressed there as well. So, and then what role do we have for those different levers in the short term to allow for the generation to become a higher mix of renewable, because there is some limits to that. So if I think about the temporal degrees of freedom across the different things like on-demand and demand response, which is kind of the go-to, but it's very consumer negative because it's interrupting current home processes or different building processes or even manufacturing processes. How do we look more at some of the deferrable, addressable, and shiftable or shimmying type of concepts as well? So just a few thoughts there on those.
Those are great. Thank you very much, Ron. We'll go to Carrie and then Samuel, and then I will turn it back to Director Clark. So Carrie?
Thanks, Doug. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm on 2 different devices.
You're fine. Thank you.
Awesome. Nothing terribly novel here. I'll just shout out to my former agency, the Department of Energy. CARA has a Powerpedia site that lists all the acronyms. Might be a useful tool to just poach. I'll see if I can get you that link. 2 is, Liesl and team, I mean, you guys are really like the chief integration officers. So I think it's so wonderful how you've structured this to allow for these crosscuts. I'll echo what I think I heard Phil say, perhaps because it's International Water Day, that taking water up is an important issue for all the obvious reasons. But one thing I will share with you is something that happened a couple of years ago now when I was perhaps just leaving my old big job. I was talking to a solar PV manufacturer that was interested in siting the manufacturing in the United States, and gone through site selection and narrowed it down to 3 spots. And then all 3 sites were impacted by hurricanes. And then they phoned to see if Michigan would want to compete. We didn't win that bid because not because we didn't have, great workforce and so on. It was actually because of our culture. So I'm just going to say that at the top of this for our group, not to ignore, as we consider all the changes that are necessary, keeping on our economic development hat, and I know MEDC, I don't know if they're here, but that's one of the particular state groups I'm going to be looking for throughout these meetings is what are we doing for jobs and for justice, and how are we thinking about how this is part of our culture, a culture shift. Many of you guys have been on calls with me where I talk about, my real passion is making sure that Michigan isn't viewed as a flyover state, because it's not. So I want to plant that seed now, and really consider how we position Michigan for the win, not only in the energy space, but nationally, considering the favorable administration we have. So off my soapbox for today, Doug.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Carrie. Samuel, you get the last comment, and then I'll turn it back to Director Clark.
Cool. Thank you, Doug. So I have one question I'll pose and one issue or idea or belief or something that I'll share. The question came to me at the end of Chairman Scripps' presentation, acknowledging DTE and consumers and other electricity providers' existing plans to decarbonize. Chairman Scripps' presentation indicated that resource planning to date has not been, in as many words, judged on climate grounds or been set up to do so. And a question I have is, what scope, if any, is there for that to change, since it seems like Public Service Commission regulatory oversight is one potentially useful lever for speeding up the pace of decarbonization. And it's also justified by economics. I mean, economics is not just about the savings on your bill, it's about social welfare, and climate, contributes greatly to that. So it ought to be counted, I think. The idea or issue, or I guess suggestion for something that potentially this energy work group or another work group should focus on, I think, is retail pricing, following on references to bills, on what Regina Strong and Justin Onwenu mentioned about energy burden and equity. That, I'm under the impression that in some way, shape, or form, retail pricing is negotiated by the electricity providers and the Public Service Commission, so that the providers get to recover their costs and maybe make some sort of like modest rate of return or something. But as long as those costs are recovered, you can, in principle, set up pricing to redistribute so as to make pricing more equitable, so as to make energy consumption more equitable. And so that it can kind of be separated from what it is that we do to reduce emissions. And that should be a focal point, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, I appreciate that. We're going to save the answer to the question because I think it would be a long one. So we appreciate that very much. Thanks for all the great ideas. Apologize, Liesl, for being a little bit over time, but want to turn it back to you to wrap us up.
Great, thank you, Doug. And I'm just going to echo Doug's comments, both in the last meeting and all of your thoughtful introductions, as well as in the course of the discussions here. It's really clear how deep this group is. And I'm just going to say, too, I know that, again, we have different levels of expertise on energy in particular, but we have different levels of expertise on all the issues we're going to deal with. So there are many of you who are, really deep over here and learning things over here and vice versa. So to me, that makes a much stronger council. And so for that, I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise and your willingness to have the conversation. So to take us forward, I wanted to just mention a couple of housekeeping things, and I'll try not to do these too quickly. Our next meeting in our cadence is April 27th. So we'll again be the fourth Tuesday at 3 p.m. I want to mention that the work groups are continuing to meet, and the communication will go out from the work group co-chairs. Meeting materials, again, as I mentioned, on that website that's in the link, but michigan.gov/climate. I also wanted to mention that the next meeting on April 27th, as I said earlier, will be around buildings. So you can kind of wrap your head around that. And we will do our best to not inundate you, but get you some good pre-reads. So we'll work to do that to level set. Finally, we are going to be having some public meetings that will be hosted by Brandy's office, the Office of Climate and Energy. So we're working to get those dates scheduled. We're going to try to do them right away in April so that we're getting input from many interested parties around climate policy. So we will be putting out some tentative dates in the near future, but I wanted to bring it up here because it's possible that they'll be happening even before our next meeting. Now, it's not critical that all of you participate. We will absolutely get you summaries of what we hear, but it is something that we think is really helpful to inform our process and give us greater understanding as we move forward with this work. So right now we're looking at April 14th and April 29th. We're trying to stagger, so one's during the day, one's in the evening. We'll still be in our virtual environment, so you can participate. We can record it, and we can also get you summaries afterwards. So, but wanted to make you aware of that. As they do get firmed up, we will be communicating with council members, with work group members, and others. And we would ask that you share it through your communities and networks so that we can get lots of participation. So with that, we're only 4 minutes over, but I am going to make the dangerous ask of if there's any quick questions for me on any of the next steps materials that I just covered, knowing that we've raised some good points that are going to require more depth that we'll do in the future. All right, I'm not seeing any hands. I'm going to say again, thank you for your time and energy, and we're going to do our best to stick to 90 minutes. I just feel like it's hard to stare at the screen for too long, but you can also see that we're working hard to get you lots of material as well. So we're trying to find that balance, and I encourage you to give us feedback as to how to do that better. We'll try to work through glossaries and reading materials and posting materials, etc. So thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thanks a lot.